Well, John Lott, welcome to the NatCon Australia podcast.
It's great to be on. Thanks very much.
No sweat. I'm speaking to you in advance of your upcoming tour to Australia. Well, we're a country that you're not completely unfamiliar with. Is that right?
Yeah, I've been to Australia one time before for, I don't know, like 10 days or something back in 1996. I mean, it's been a while since I've visited your beautiful country, but I have fond memories.
But you've obviously have an academic interest because of the gun laws here, and you've studied those quite closely and compared those to what you have in the United States, right?
Well, and compare them to the rest of the world too. Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I've done a lot of work on crime over the decades. And, I'm happy to talk about crime rates in Australia, talk about different types of regulations. One thing that strikes me is that I'm kind of shocked by kind of the misimpression people have in Australia about how their crime rates compare to other places in the world. And I think there's some misunderstandings about the impact of the different gun control laws on Australia.
Let's get to that a little bit later on. I thought I'd start with a broader question. Um, Australia and the United States, they're both New World English speaking Anglo democracies. Um, but at least in the last sort of couple of decades, they've had very divergent views about gun rights. What do you think explains the difference?
Well, I think part of it is just the different type of legislative systems that you have. The United States system was designed from the beginning to make it more difficult to quickly pass laws. You have a House of Representatives, you have a Senate, and you have a president, and they can be controlled by different parties that are there. And also in the Senate, you can have a filibuster, which requires that you have to have more than 60 votes in order to get something passed, not just a simple majority of 51. And so that slows down the process. And so it means in a lot of things, you may have kind of a more radical government that gets in charge at one point in time in a parliamentary system, and they can pass all sorts of things because they don't have the same checks and balances that we have here in the United States. And so after you had the 1996 Tasmania attack, you guys passed some very draconian gun control laws. In the United States, there may have been those types of moves temporarily, and maybe if one party had controlled everything with sufficient majorities, they maybe we could have passed some similar types of things. The other thing is, though, we have a constitution that constrains what government can do in terms of our Bill of Rights, both in terms of free speech. I mean, Australia is passing all sorts of speech regulations, which would be struck down by the courts here in the United States. And, similarly with regard to our Second Amendment here, restricting it. So, um, you know, those all those things, both in terms of legislative restrictions and in terms of constitutional restrictions, they've kind of prevented the United States from going in the same direction that Australia's gone.
Mm. But there have been periods in American history where, quite, from at least from Australian perspective, quite incredible restrictions have been imposed through the legislature. There's been prohibition, where alcohol was effectively outlawed in the United States. I think there was
Yeah.
confiscation of gold by FDR, which never happened in Australia. There's lots of areas you can point to where the federal government has you know taken action which we haven't quite seen in Australia, sending um, the
Well,
marine
there's
or
no
the
right.
troops into the Arkansas and that type of thing. So it's just it is, but we don't have the Second Amendment that you guys have, which has, at least from the gun rights perspective, provided a basis for you know
Right, yeah, you don't
restricting
have a
any.
First Amendment or you don't have a Second Amendment. And
Mm,
so, when you had the COVID lockdown, I suspect you guys were not allowing people to go to church services and things like that. Well, our First
mm,
Amendment protects things like people being able to go and do things like that if they want to. So,
Mm,
but with regard to prohibition, there's no part of the Constitution that kind of guarantees people's rights to go and drink alcoholic beverages.
mm,
Um, and with regard to the other thing that you're talking about during the 1930s, with regard to gold, um, you know, you had the Democrats essentially, in an unusual situation, have big super majorities in both houses and also had the presidency at the same time. So they had much more free reign to go and do lots of different things on the economic front that they otherwise normally couldn't have done.
mm. But do you think there's
And
something, sociologically, also at play in Australia rather than that explains the differences in recent times? Because we've had, as I think as you and others have pointed out, Australia, used to be people used to have guns in their house a lot more sort of,
right.
frequently, but it's just been in the last couple of years where that that has changed. Not only
Well,
brought out
actually, there,
yeah.
I take a little bit of difference with you on that. Obviously, with the confiscation you had in 1996 and 97, you had about a 28% reduction in gun ownership there in Australia. Uh, but people were able to go and buy guns again after that. And by at least 2010, if not beforehand, the gun ownership rate in Australia was back up as a percentage of the population was back above what it was before the confiscation. So, I mean, it's gone up and down over time in Australia. Look, my guess is if there were times where there was a lot of pressure to go and get gun control regulations passed in the United States, and in part because the constraints that I was mentioning before, both legislatively and constitutionally, it kind of stopped it from doing it. Plus, there's one other difference, and that is I think there's been more diversity of opinion with regard to academics in the United
Mhm,
States than there has been with regard to Australia. I think generally academia in Australia is kind of more to the left. I mean, it's pretty bad and gotten more so in the United States over time. But uh, you'd have people who would speak out on this type of thing and kind of provide kind of the intellectual arguments and basis for both sides of the debate. I think that's been missing to a large extent in Australia, and it's very unfortunate because a lot of really, I can only describe it as statistical malpractice has gone on with
mhm,
regard to a lot of the debate. So, for example, after the 96 and 97 gun confiscations, um, a lot of the discussions by Howard and your former Prime Minister Howard and others would simply compare the before and after averages for things like firearm homicides or firearm suicides. Well, I would hope most academics, if you were to press them on it, would realize that that can be extremely misleading. Let me give you a simple example. Let's say I had a perfectly straight line that was falling over the entire period of time. I could pick any point along that line, and the after average is going to be below the before average. But if I'm looking at that perfectly straight line and it's falling at exactly the same rate before a law changes and exactly the same rate afterwards, I'm looking at it and I say, well, it's true the after average is below the before average, but it's pretty hard for me to see that it had any beneficial impact there. It was changing at exactly the same rate before and after. And so what you'd want to do is say, does it fall at a faster rate or a slower rate? Is there some discontinuity that occurs in the line there? And it doesn't seem like there was really anybody. I mean, I testified before the Australian Senate and made the point that, look, if you look at firearm homicides and firearm suicides, they were both falling for 15 years in a row before the confiscation occurred. Firearm homicides actually stopped falling for about 8 years afterwards. And firearm suicides, while they continued to fall, did so at a slower rate than they were beforehand. And so I look at this and I say, if anything, If I'm telling you it's falling and then it stops falling when the law occurs, that seems bad. It doesn't seem good. Doesn't seem like there was a beneficial effect from it. And for particularly for things like suicides, I think you would look at total suicides, not just firearm suicides. There are many different ways that people can go and commit suicides. And if you look at total suicides actually went up by 20% after the confiscation. Okay.
mm,
And so I'm not going to go and argue that the confiscation caused suicides to go up, but it sure as heck isn't consistent with it improving the situation there. And total homicides actually went up afterwards. And so, and then there's a third problem with it, and that is, um, as I mentioned before, uh, after you had the confiscation, there was an immediate sharp drop of about 28% in terms of gun ownership, but then it went up, okay? And if the gun control advocates are right, you should have seen an immediate sharp drop in firearm homicides, for example, and then an increase over time as the gun ownership rate went up, and the same with suicides. But you don't see anything like it, not even
mm,
remotely similar. I mean, these are just very simple statistical points to make there, and it just doesn't seem that there's really any academics in Australia that were either able to or interested or wanting to go and make those types of arguments.
mm,
The Australian academics that I've seen basically just parrot the line of saying, well, the after average is below the before average. And either they're not very good at what they do, or they know what's going on, and as too often happens in academia, people let their ideological biases kind of blind what they say. But that's also an important difference, I think, between the United States and Australia. You don't have people who are willing to speak out and kind of engage in the academic debate there.
mm. Are there any people that you respect, not just in Australia, but across America and elsewhere in the world, who uh, who are intellectually rigorous proponents of gun restrictions, which you obviously disagree with, but you can engage with, and you might learn things from.
Look, I'm happy to debate anybody,
Mm,
and I debated everybody. The problem I usually find is that people are unwilling to debate me. I
mm,
can't tell you the number of times, like, so I go and give talks on university campuses, and I can't tell you, maybe of the last 50 times I've been asked to go and do debates on university campuses, maybe there's been like twice. They've been able to go and get another person to debate me there.
mm,
And, neither of those will debate a second time. So it just, and you have the same thing in terms of media coverage. Look, um, I have to say, so I've been an academic, been had a lot of positions. I've been at Stanford, University of Chicago, the Wharton Business School, UCLA, Yale, Rice, um, and uh, and I'd been involved in a lot of academic debates before I kind of got into the gun debate. I really wasn't interested in guns. I kind of got into it by completely by accident, and but I kind of got stuck in it simply because I'd never seen so much misinformation being put out there by other academics. I don't know what it is. In the United States, if you look at surveys of political views, probably gun control, maybe even more than abortion, uh, divides people by party overwhelmingly, and
mm,
uh, and, a lot of the debate in the United States on guns is primarily done on the gun control side, is primarily done by public health people. And I guess I just don't have a lot of respect for most of the public health people, just like I didn't have it during COVID. And it's a very different mindset than what an economist has. Economists are thinking about trade-offs. So just the example I just gave you on suicide, If I pass a law that lowers firearm suicides but increases total suicides, is that good? I don't know. You wanna look at what's gonna save the most lives that are there rather
Mm.
than just looking at one particular type of thing. And public health people, for example, will only look at firearm homicides and firearm suicides. They don't look at the total there. Um, and and I've written a book, The War on Guns, that basically goes through public health research on firearms. Um, so, during COVID, a lot of them would say, if we can just save one life by having a restriction, then we should go and have the restriction. And, I, you know, my view is, well, maybe you'll save one life from somebody not directly getting the disease, but what about suicides? What about other costs that are there, in terms of kids not going to school for some period of time and not learning? Uh, so, economists kind of are much broader and looking at substitution effects and looking at other things than public health people are. Um, and I guess I just don't have a huge amount of respect for public health research out there.
Yeah. Hey, one of the trade-offs which you argue we suffer in Australia because of the strict gun laws is an increase in crime. Can you maybe talk a little bit to that? What has your research shown over the years with respect to the sort of relationship between strict gun laws and an increase in crime?
Sure. Well, first of all, people have to realize that there are two different measures that exist out there on crime. There's crimes reported to police, and then there's some measures of total crime. The Australian Bureau of Statistics does a survey each year, a large survey, like 25,000 people. In the United States, the Bureau of Justice Statistics does a large survey of about 240,000 people each year to try to get a measure of total crime. Because one thing we've known for many decades is that most crimes aren't reported to police. Maybe about 40% of violent or 43% of violent crimes are reported. Maybe about 30% of property crimes are reported. In Australia, uh, you actually have a lower rate of crimes being reported to police. So if you take something like rape and sexual assaults, in the United States, about 45% of sexual assaults and rapes are reported to police. In Australia, it's like 19%. That's a pretty big difference. And it just is an indication that you should be a little careful in just looking at crimes reported to police. And we know people have studied this for years. We know that there are lots of things that affect whether or not people report crimes to the police. One of the big things that determines whether people report crimes to the police are things like, are the police going to catch them? So if you have a relatively low arrest rate for it, so I was just in Argentina giving talks to police and others there a little while ago. Um, just a comparison. Uh, the kind of the official robbery rate in Argentina is 1,060 per 100,000 people. In the United States, it's about 60 per 100,000. But the arrest rate in Australia for robbery is like 9%. Okay, and so you try to explain to them, guys, I'm willing to bet you, even though it's an astronomically high robbery rate of 1,060, it's probably a lot higher than that. Okay. They don't have a survey like the Australian Bureau of Statistics survey that you have in Australia, we have here. Uh, and I think they understand, the police understand when you talk to them about that. But anyway, that's one measure. And so what you want to try to do is to look, I think the gold standard is to try to get a measure of total crime, particularly when you're comparing it across countries. Now, there used to be this survey called the International Crime Victimization Survey. Unfortunately, the last time that was done in 2005. And the nice thing about that is it made sure that the exact same questions were being asked across different countries. And they had other things to kind of make sure that everything was comparable across countries. Unfortunately, the UN took it over and basically killed it at that afterwards. And I think in part they were doing it for politics because they didn't like the way it was showing some countries were looking bad relative to others. But at the time, the violent crime rate in Australia was about 75% higher than the violent crime rate in the United States.
Is that right? Wow.
You can make you can make comparisons, and my impression from talking to Australians, I don't is that they seem to think Australia has a low violent crime rate compared to the United States. And I think
Mm.
partly that comes about because they just are looking at crimes reported to police and not trying to compare the total crimes. The other thing is even the survey that you have from the Australian Bureau of Statistics is a little funky because they're not asking you what they don't record how many crimes you've been a victim of. They just say, "Have you been a victim of robbery?" Let's say over the course of last year. So in certain places, you may find they could be robbed twice or three times over the course of a year. In Australia, that's still in your survey, it's only going to count as one time that's there. In the United States, the survey that we do here would count each of those as a separate case. And so you gotta be a little careful in doing, but even if you don't adjust for that, it's pretty clear that Australia has a significantly higher, violent crime rate than the United States in terms of
Is
rape, robbery, and assaults. And if
is
you
that
do adjust for it, it's much
is
higher.
is that true? C Not true as a nation as a whole, but is that true with regard to, say, somewhere like, Los Angeles or Atlanta or Chicago or Detroit? I mean, it seems to me that those places, metropolitan centers, are much more dangerous places,
Well,
than
I'm sure
than
again, but
Brisbane.
I was comparing right. Again, I was comparing Australia as a whole to the United States
Yep.
as a whole. Obviously,
Mm,
you're gonna have places in both places which are gonna have higher and other places lower. One
mm,
thing that's unique about the United States in terms of crimes is we're very unusual in terms of how geographically concentrated crimes are. So if you take
mm.
something like murder, for example, uh, about 56% of the murders in the United States take place in 2% of the counties. And if you ever look at what's called a murder map, which graphs out where the murders are occurring in each of those counties, two-thirds of their murders in those 2% of the counties take place in 10-block areas. There's really no other country in the world that has crime that's as very heavily concentrated in tiny areas as you have in the United States. You look at murders, for example, in the United States, you have about you have over 50% of the counties in the United States have 0 murders in any given year. You have another 19% or so which have 1 murder. So you have about 70% of the counties in the United States have 0 or 1 murder in the course of a year.
So
Uh,
so so where are the dangerous counties in the US? Where are
the
they?
two well, basically, it's 60 of the 3,140 counties account for 56% of the murders. And so it'd be places like, uh, Los Angeles, DC, Memphis, Detroit, Atlanta, places like that.
Mm, okay. Um, I mean, the other thing that the United States, um, dominates discussion about, shooting and gun laws in the United States are the school shootings, right? The terrible school shootings, Columbine, Sandy Hook, and Robb Elementary. I I don't believe Australia has had quite the same phenomenon that the United States has, although you can point to particular examples that might fit the category. Um, what explains the difference, and what can be realistically done to prevent those events in future in America?
Sure. Well, first of all, let's just deal with the numbers there. Since 2000, there have been 9 mass public school shootings in the United States, attacks where 4 or more people have been killed, not part of like a gang fight over drug turf or something like that, where somebody goes in, the exact cases that you were giving, somebody goes in with the sole purpose of trying to harm as many people as possible. One thing that people don't do is they don't adjust for population differences. So the United States has 340 million people. Compare it to Germany. Since 2000, Germany has had 3 mass public school shootings, but Germany has a population of about 83, 84 million people. So, if you were to adjust for by a factor of 4, okay, that would be the equivalent of the United States having 12. Or you have a country like Finland, which, since 2000 has had 2 mass public school shootings. Finland has a population of 5.5 million people. So you'd adjust by 60, that would be the equivalent of the United States having 120. Now, nobody, I assume, is gonna go and compare the number of murders in the United States. I mean, you have, like, 30 million people in Australia? A little bit less, something like around that?
That's
Yeah,
yeah.
so we have 340 million people. Nobody's gonna compare the total number of murders, I assume, in Australia with the total number of murders in the United States. You'd adjust for population differences, right? You'd put in per capita rates. But for
Mm,
some reason, when you're talking about mass public shootings like this, people don't do that. And the United States gets a lot of attention. But, if you look at mass public shootings generally, we did a study looking at 20 years of data from 1998 through 2017. And over that period of time, the United States, we had 98 countries we had data for. The United States ranked 65th in terms of the per capita rate of mass public shooting. If if you were just to compare the United States with Western Europe, since let's say 2010, could you name for me where the 2 worst mass public shootings have been?
off the
Just
top of my head,
Western
no.
Europe and the United States.
I have not off the top of my head, no.
Well, you have the uh, end of 2015 attack at the Paris concert shooting where 130 people were killed. And you have the 2011 attack in Norway where 67 people were killed. Both of those were much worse than any of the mass public shootings that we've had in the United States. Now, so, um, but when attacks occur in other countries, like in Europe or what have you, uh, they just don't get the same long term attention that the attacks do in the United States. And, I guess I can understand that to some extent. But uh, so anyway, the thing is, if you read the diaries and manifestos for the mass murderers in the United States, and I forced myself to read them, it's amazing how similar they are one right after another. And it also is amazing how biased the media is in terms of how it covers it. These guys, time after time, will explain why they pick the target that they do. They may be crazy in some sense, but they're not stupid. Their goal is to commit suicide, but to get media attention. Overwhelmingly, you're talking about people who are suicidal, but feel unappreciated. And they want to go out kind of for people to know that they were here. You'll very frequently read statements saying, if I can only kill more people than such and such did, I can get more media attention. The Sandy Hook killer, for example, um, he had uh, he had done what the police described as a doctoral dissertation, where he had looked at mass public shootings over the previous 40 years worldwide and had graphed out the relationship between the number of people killed in an attack and the amount of media coverage that they had gotten to prove to himself that he could go and if he could go and kill more people, he could go and get more media attention. And his goal was to go and kill more people than the Norway person had killed because he wanted to get even more worldwide news attention. Now, I can't prove this, but I think the reason why he given what I know about him, my educated guess is the reason why he picked an elementary school was in large part the shock value of killing young kids because he thought that that would go and get him even more media attention. So, if you're going to stop these attacks, what you have to do is try try to figure out how to make convince them that they're not going to get the media attention. Okay, and when you read this, and this is one my biggest pet peeves with the media coverage. The media will cover the diaries and manifestos, but it will never, ever, ever go and talk about their long discussions about why they pick the targets that they do. And
mm,
time after time, they have the same thing. They pick the targets that they do because they want to go to a place where guns are banned, because then they'll be the only person that will have a gun there. It'll be easier for them to go and kill people. So
mm,
so you have something like the in September, we had this attack at a school in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a Catholic school. 2 people were killed, 17 people were wounded. The murderer there, spends a great deal of time talking about other mass murderers in his manifesto that he had there. Um, and the media will mention that he talks about them, but they ignore the fact that why he talked about them, and why he talked about them was he learned from them to go to a gun-free zone. So in Minnesota, if you or I were to carry a permitted concealed handgun onto school property, we'd face 5 years in prison. That's a huge penalty for us. Our lives would be completely overturned and destroyed. But let's say you're this guy who's planning on murdering lots of people. And, given he murdered 2 people and wounded 17 others, he may have been facing like 5 or 6 life sentences, essentially. Does taking 5 years away from his 6th or 7th life, assuming he had even lived, he died at the scene, and that's usually what happens in these attackers. But even if he had lived, okay, is taking 5 years away from his 6th life gonna be a penalty for him? And the answer is no.
mm,
There's no marginal penalty that you're imposing on him. So what you've done with these laws is essentially make it clear to the murderer that he'll be the only person that will have a weapon, and they understand that. And
mm,
so they purposely look, in most of the United States, you're able to go and carry a permanent concealed handgun, okay? But there are tiny areas, maybe a couple percent of a state where you're not able to carry. Where do you think the attacks occur? 92% of the mass public shootings occur in places where guns are banned. It's not random. If it was random, then it'd be like equal probability that it would be in a place that guns are banned versus others. And that's
mm,
definitely not the case. Now, there's one argument that I have with conservatives here in the United States, a number of them, and that is they want to have uniformed school resource officers in schools or in other places to go and guard them. And the problem you have to understand is that having somebody in uniform makes their job incredibly difficult in stopping these mass public shootings. And the reason is because the attackers there have real tactical advantages. Okay. If I see somebody in uniform and I'm thinking about shooting up a place, what can I do? I can either wait for the officer to leave the area before I attack, right? Or I can move on to another target myself, maybe another school building, all right? Or if I'm going to attack that place, who do you think I shoot first? I'm going to shoot the guy
mm,
in uniform. It's kind of like a neon sign above him that says shoot me first because he's the one guy I know has a weapon and might be able to go and stop me. If you read the diaries and manifestos, they spell this stuff out clearly in these things. You
really?
know, and so we recently finished a study, and I think I'm going to be giving this at ANU when I'm out there. Um, is We looked at all these active shooting attacks in the United States from 2014 through 2024. And what we found was that civilians with concealed carry permits stopped more of these attacks than police did. But even though police stopped fewer attacks, they were 12 times more likely to end up being killed than armed civilians were because
Really?
they have this huge disadvantage. Now, there are real reasons why you have police in uniform. I'm not trying to say police shouldn't be in uniform, but you have to understand and be sympathetic with them because the incredibly difficult job we're putting police in by having them in uniform and trying to stop these attacks because it makes them a target. And I don't think people appreciate what an incredibly
Mm,
difficult job police have in trying to stop these attacks. It makes it less likely that they'll be there at the scene when the attack occurs. And it makes it more likely that if they are there, they'll be more likely to be killed.
mm. So you would say, in relation to the terrible, Bondi Beach massacre, which happened recently in Australia, I'm
For sure.
sure you're aware of, that if people had, if civilians had the ability to have guns, then potentially at least they would have been able to shoot back, and that
Well, I think there's less
the
likely the attack would even have occurred to begin with.
yeah,
Ye
right.
and, so, we have about 14,000 public schools in the United States that have armed teachers and staff, all right? Uh, there has not been one single attack at a public school in the United States where teachers and staff are armed, where anybody's been wounded or killed. All the attacks have occurred in places where the guns are banned, even when you've
Mm,
had school resource officers, the police officers that are there. And, if you read their diaries and manifestos, you see why that's the case. Um, and so, uh, again, I wish people would. I mean, we collect these stories on our website at crimeresearch.org. Um, but, people just have to read the diaries and manifestos. These guys may be crazy in some sense, but they're not stupid. Rather than having a sign in front of a school that says this school is a gun-free zone, have a sign in front of the school that says, "Warning, select teachers and staff at this school are carrying concealed, and we'll use them to go and stop, an attack from occurring."
mm,
Nationwide in the United States, we have about 21 million concealed carry permit holders. Um, we have 29 constitutional carry states where it's not even necessary to have a permit to be able to go and carry. I've done some surveys that indicate that uh, about 8% of the population are carrying all the time or almost all the time, and about 7% are carrying some of the time. Um, you know, just compare that to police in the United and I've looked at similar numbers in Australia. In the United States, we have about 670,000 police. You have about a third at most on duty at any point in time when you consider vacations and other things that are going on. So you have like 220,000. You have 220,000 people on duty at any time to go and protect a country of 340 million people. In Australia, you have about one officer on duty for every 1,200 people or something like that. So you're asking a lot to go and protect everybody that's there. And, it's one of the reasons why I think Australia has such a high violent crime rate. Look, this isn't rocket science. If you wanna reduce crime, you make it risky for criminals to go and commit crime. That means higher arrest rates, higher conviction rates, longer prison sentences, but it also can be reduced by allowing victims to be able to go and defend themselves. If victims can
mm,
defend themselves, that also makes it riskier for criminals to go and commit crime. Um, when I was chief economist at the U.S. Sentencing Commission in Washington, I must have read through more than 1,000 trial transcripts. And you'd very frequently have one criminal turning state's evidence against another criminal. He'd testify in court against his accomplice with a plea bargain that's there. And the questions that the prosecution would ask would be the same time after time. If you're talking about a robbery, it'd be something like, how did you guys pick the victim that you picked there? And the guy would say, well, we talked about going after the drug dealer down the street, but, you know, drug dealers have lots of guns and it'd be really crazy to go after them. So we didn't want to go after them. And then we talked about, well, maybe we go after cab drivers because cab drivers may often be carrying a fair amount of money. But a lot of cab drivers are armed. And so we didn't want to do that. And then we saw this small woman walking alone at night across a parking lot, and she looked like a really easy victim that's there. And so we went after her. And so um, I don't know the data for Australia on this, but there's something called hot burglaries. I know the data for Canada. I know the data for the UK. I've tried looking it up in Australia, but I don't think you guys keep this data. And that those are burglaries that occur in the residence while the people are at home. Okay. Uh, in the United, if you compare the United States to the UK, for example, The UK has about twice the burglary rate that the United States has, okay? Um, almost 60% of the burglaries in the UK occur while the residents are at home. In the United States, it's about 13%. One of the other big differences with, burglaries in the United States and the UK is that, burglaries in the United States occur kind of in the middle of the day. In the UK, they occur at, like, 8 or 9 at night. Does anybody know why that occurs?
Well,
Because
presumably the argument with yeah, people are armed in the States and they don't wanna
well, but
have
why
someone
why
come in.
okay, but why do the burglary at 2 in the afternoon in the United States and do it at 8 o'clock in the evening in the UK?
Because there's no one home in the States at 2
Right,
I'm
yeah,
not
if
sure.
you so first of all, exactly. American burglars spend about twice as long casing homes, even though they're doing it in the middle of the day to make sure
Mm,
nobody's home compared to their British counterparts. And the reason why they do it in the evening in Britain is because that way the people are home so they can tell them where the valuables are.
mm,
You know,
mm,
they wanna be able to force them to tell them where the valuables are or to open up a safe or something like that if they happen to have that. In the United States, they're willing to forego getting that additional information because they don't wanna take the risk of getting shot. And
mm,
so you have not only twice as many burglaries, but the burglaries in the UK are occurring when the people are at home. And you have more damage, you have more other types of crimes occurring too. So it's just an example of how you can make it risky and costly, to go and have criminals commit crime and how they respond as a result. So you have twice the burglaries and it's almost 59% of the time that people are at home when they occur.
mm. Um, what was I gonna ask? I mean, are there one of the requirements the Albanese government has recently introduced in the wake of the Bondi massacre is that only citizens should be allowed to own guns. Well, what do you think of that requirement? And what limits more broadly do you think, if any, should be placed on gun ownership or defensive weapons? I mean, where are there limits that
Well, I
that
guess,
you think should
I'm a very data-driven person. I don't deal with
mm,
rights or whatever. And in order to kinda do that, you have to have changes that occur over time in terms of the rules. We really haven't had changes in that dimension in the United States. One thing I will mention is that most of the academic research in the world uses US data. And the reason why it uses US data is because we have 51 different laboratories that are there. You have different states passing different laws at different points of time. And so there's basically 3 types of data out there. You have what's called purely time series data, which is you're looking at one place over time. The problem is it's very hard to disentangle all the different things that can happen when you only have one experiment that's occurring. Um, and for most countries, laws are always passed at the national level that deal with anything like this. The other comparison, it's what you normally see in newspapers and stuff, is purely cross sectional comparisons. You're looking at different places at one point in time. The problem is that can be extremely misleading. And I'll give you a simple example. So, in the United States, um, a lot of people compare the United States to the UK and they'll say, "Look, the UK has a lower homicide rate than the United States. It has extremely strict gun control laws, and so it must be the fact that they have strict gun control laws which explains the low homicide rate compared to the United States." Well, there are a couple problems. One is before the UK had its gun control laws, it had even lower homicide rates compared to the United States. So after the 1997 handgun ban that went into effect, the homicide rate in the UK over the next 8 years went up by 50%. Uh, you go back, the first the first UK gun control laws were in 1920, okay? Had nothing to do with crime. It had to do with the fact that, uh, you had a lot of unemployed soldiers after World War I that were there, And you had just had the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And people in the UK were concerned that these unemployed soldiers were going to go and have guns and overthrow the government that was there. So they essentially passed licensing rules that made it so that lower class and kind of many middle class people couldn't afford the licensing fees and other things to go and get guns that were there. And so you go back to 1900, there's an excellent book from Harvard University Press called Guns and Violence by Joyce Lee Malcolm, who's a historian. I can't even get my mind around these numbers. So there's no gun control in the UK. London, a city of like 8.5 million people at the time, had two gun murders.
Mm.
Two gun murders in a city of 8.5 million people with no gun control regulations. If you wanna do something fun sometime, go and pick up old copies of the, Sunday London Times, because if you do it from that period of time, what you'll find is they had all sorts of guns constantly advertised, walking stick guns, briefcase guns, book guns. So you could carry a briefcase, and if you pressed a lever on the briefcase, it would shoot a bullet out. That's what they were advertising in the Sunday Lundy Times. It was all over the place. I mean, God only knows how many guns people had at that time. And yet, even though everybody's, guns were all over the place, they had two gun murders. They had five armed robberies. I mean, I can't even get my mind around how you could have so few violent crimes like that in such a major urban area. So there's obviously really important social differences that exist across different places that are completely independent of gun control that's there. So they've had three major gun control laws in the UK: 1920, 1956, and 1997. And the thing is, violent crime rates tended to go up after the different laws that they had there. Now, and violent crime in the UK is much higher than violent crime in the United States. Murders are lower. Um, what most people don't appreciate when you compare murder rates across different countries is the United States, and this kind of gets back to what I was talking about earlier with our murders being so heavily concentrated in tiny areas. We have a drug gang problem in the United States. And you have a lot of drug gangs that fight against each other in order to try to control drug turf. The highest murder rate we ever had in the United States was probably 1932. There's a little bit of debate about quality of measurement and stuff like that that's there. But 1932 was the last year of prohibition in the United States. You had the mobs were fighting against each other in order to control turf to go and sell alcohol. Uh, and when prohibition ended in 1933, murder rates fell. In the next 2 years, murder rates in the United States had fallen by about 60%. And they basically remain low until you get to the mid 1960s when we have drug problems start to occur in the United States. But we have a lot of money can be made from drugs, and you can explain a good portion of the ups and downs in murder rates in the United States by changes in the profitability for going and selling illegal drugs. Mexico, which is right next door, Mexico um, has had since 1972 has had one gun store in the country. It's operated by the military. Guns are extremely expensive. You have to pay a $2,300 fee just to apply to get a license to have a gun, and that doesn't guarantee you to get it. Only about less than 1/10 of 1% of the adult population in Mexico is legally licensed to own a gun. And the most powerful gun that you're able to go and own in Mexico is a 22 caliber short round bolt action rifle. I promise you that's not the gun that the drug cartels are using in Mexico. And yet,
Mm.
in many recent years, Mexico's murder rate is as high as 6 times higher than the murder rate than we have in the United States. Uh, their murder rate is more than twice as high what it was after they passed their strict gun control laws in 1972.
So I mean, so you would say, getting back to the original question, that there's just not the data to work out whether it makes any meaningful difference or not, if you restrict guns to citizens or not. I mean,
Yeah, I
and
just
what
don't
other
know. I mean, I can't. I
what res-
tried to answer that to begin
what?
with. I mean, I
Yeah,
could
yeah,
guess, but
yeah.
look, here's what I'll tell you. In the
Mm,
We have basically 3 groups of people in the United States. We have
yeah,
American citizens, legal immigrants, and
mm,
illegal immigrants.
yeah,
Legal immigrants in the United States commit crimes at very low rates. Illegal immigrants in the United States commit crimes at very high rates, okay?
mm,
And so, I in the United States, we allow legal immigrants to be able to go and own guns, all right?
mm,
So, I all I can tell you is, um I don't see any obvious data or evidence, though it's not the perfect test to go that I would like to do on this. I'd like to see change before and after, some type of change in the rules that are there, uh, and do it in multiple places. But
mm.
all I can tell you is that legal immigrants tend to commit crimes at very low rates as a whole.
What about data on, I mean, just again, wondering where the limits, what reasonable limits you think might be useful. I mean, on defensive weaponry more generally, do you have a view on, like, mace and pepper spray, which isn't
Yeah,
lethal but
sure.
is defensive?
Yeah, sure. People
And what
study
about
that a lot. Yeah,
people,
sure.
things like even defensive drones? Should people be allowed to have those, or is there simply, you just don't have a view on that, or it hasn't been studied enough?
It hasn't been studied. I haven't
Mm,
looked at defensive drones. I don't know how I would look at that off the top of my
mm,
head. But,
mm,
again, I don't make rights types arguments or something like that. I
mm,
try to limit myself to the data that I've been able to study. And, what I can say, we've studied mace and, other types of, things and, stun guns, for example. And, there are real limits to mace. If uh, if you're outside, depending upon weather conditions, like, whether it's raining or whether it's windy, uh, it may not be very useful at all to go and use mace. Um, it also depends upon the person that you're using it on. Uh, People develop tolerances fairly quickly for something like that. So you have somebody, a criminal maybe, who's had it sprayed on him before. It may not have a huge impact on him, and it may take 30 seconds or something like that for it to have an impact. A lot can happen in 30 seconds to the person who's being attacked in that time. With regard to stun guns, you fire these electrical wires out that hit somebody. Um, the New York Police Department's probably the first police department in the country that widely use them, and they have a lot of data over a lot of decades. And what you find is that it has an impact in about 30% or so of the cases. It depends upon time of year. It depends upon what type of clothing somebody's wearing. If they're wearing heavy jackets or whatever. It depends on what type of footwear they're wearing. Are they wearing heavily rubberized sole shoes on their feet? If they are, you're not going to get the same grounding that you would get otherwise. Um, and so it varies a lot there. 30%, that's better than nothing. And maybe the thing is, the police that go and carry these things like uh, stun guns, they also always carry a gun as a backup because they know that there are limits in terms of what can be used.
and so you would say the short answer is that it's better to just have the gun rather than these other,
Oh, yeah,
options
there's
and ways.
absolutely no doubt about it. We have our National Crime Victimization Survey uh, breaks it down. There's like 10 different types of ways people can defend themselves because have you been a victim of a crime? They'll ask you how you responded. They'll get the characteristics of the criminal and the time of day and the type of crime, and they'll get information on what the outcome was. By far, and it's particularly true for women and the elderly, people who are relatively weaker physically, by far the safest course of action for somebody to take when they're confronted by a criminal is to have a gun. By far, it's not even close. And
Interesting.
you don't get as big
I'm
of a
not
benefit for men.
the other types of thing. I'm just, conscious we're running close to time.
Oh,
So
sorry.
final question. Looking ahead, Is it possible to give any predictions about the way you think um, gun policy will develop in the United States and, as I guess, Australia and elsewhere in Western Europe over the next of the coming days? What do you expect?
Well, I think in the United States, at least right now, things are heading in a direction where they were allowing people to go and defend themselves. What I can tell you is, who knows? In the future, uh, Democrats are promising if they get into power again, they're going to get rid of the filibuster. And if they do, they're going to be able to go and stack the Supreme Court in the United States, packet. And if they do that, you know, who knows? They'll be able to go and undo all sorts of things that are there. And but at least right now, I think this is the way it's heading. Um, with regard to Australia and other places, I mean, obviously, I'm looking at this at a big distance, but my impression is that those who want to be able to own guns are making the wrong arguments. I've I've seen, and it's something that I've kind of learned in the United States. So like at one time, the National Rifle Association, the NRA, um, when they would go on TV or radio, they would always talk about the constitutional right for somebody to go and own a gun. And, I never make those arguments, and it's not interested me, and I didn't go into it to begin with, but what you have to understand is there are basically 3 groups of people out there. There are those who will agree with you no matter almost what you say, those who will disagree, and then you got people in the middle. And the thing is, the people in the middle, uh, care about safety, and if you go and just say, "Well, I have a right to do this," you lose those people almost immediately. What you have to explain to them how these gun control laws actually reduce their safety. And so, um, uh, and I think that's changed over time, and I think I probably had some role in changing that. Uh, and so you have something like we're talking about gun-free zones to begin with. I understand the desire to go and just ban guns from an area. You think, well, that makes it safer. We just ban the guns. The problem is who obeys those laws? The people who are most likely to obey the law are going to be the good law abiding people, not the criminals. And to the extent you disarm law abiding citizens relative to criminals, you actually make it easier for criminals to go and commit crimes. So you have these mass shootings and other things that are occurring there. I'll give you a very simple example. There are places around the world that have either banned all guns or all handguns. In the United States, we tried it in Chicago and Washington, D.C., but there are island nations like Jamaica or the Republic of Ireland or the UK, the Solomon Islands, other places that have banned either all guns or all handguns. Um, every single time that either all guns or all handguns have been banned, murder rates have gone up. Every single time. You think out of randomness, once or twice, banning all guns would make things, murder rates or homicide rates go down or at least stay the same. And yet you see these huge increases every single time. And so, and it basically the same point, and that is when you go and you ban guns, who obeys the rules? And this applies more than just a ban. It applies to gun control laws generally. You have to be careful that the laws that you're passing aren't going to primarily disarm law abiding citizens relative to criminals. And so, you have these rules in Australia that requiring everybody has to lock up their guns. You make it difficult for people or, legal problems for using a gun defensively. Uh, once you concede that, then you really lose a lot of the arguments that you can make with regard to gun control because there's really no counter argument for the new rules that they want to have because you're not giving up anything in terms of people's safety by going and passing another law at that point. And so, um, so anyway, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's interesting, and I'm sort of curious, and I could go on and ask all sorts of other detailed questions because I know your books cover all sorts of aspects of the gun gun control
I got ten
arguments.
books.
Yeah, I've read a few of them, and they're very interesting. Yeah, I do kind of wonder, because of the demographic changes in places like Australia and the US, whether the the traditional American love of guns will change because there are different people coming from different cultures who don't
Yeah, sure.
haven't had that tradition, and that may change the politics on this
Look,
issue going
I
forward.
assume that's one reason why the Democrats let in, I don't know, maybe up to 20 million illegals or so during the Biden administration.
Mm,
Um, I just was reading today in Spain, this socialist government there is essentially giving citizenship to the illegals that were there. And they explicitly say the reason why they're doing that is to prevent the crazy right wing, as they call their political opponents, from winning the next election. You know,
yeah,
and and so uh,
it's
in
it's
the United States, one of the puzzles is why do Democrats fight so hard against deporting illegal aliens who have done murder or rape or robbery, child rape? Why don't you want to deport people who are child rapists?
their votes, I guess, is part of the reason.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, even if they don't vote yet, what you do is they still count in our census, and they still count
Mm,
towards congressional seats. So
mm.
California probably has the latest estimate I've seen probably has about six more congressional seats than they otherwise would have had if they didn't have a lot of illegal aliens living in California, for example.
Yeah, and a different culture means people bring different
Yeah, yeah, I
attitudes
agree.
towards gun control and elsewhere. So yeah, John, I could talk to you for a lot longer, but I try to keep things to an hour. I'll put your website where people can find the stack of articles and interviews you've done, as well as links to the books that you've written on these issues. I do think the debate on this issue in Australia is very, very narrow and could be broadened. You are coming out here. I'll to the extent that's public, I can let people know. But otherwise, I look forward to meeting maybe when you're out here, and
That would
good
be
luck with
awesome.
your trip. Yeah,
That would be
really appreciate
awesome.
it.
Thanks
Thanks for
very
your
much.
time.
I really
Good man.
appreciate it. Thank
Bye.
you.